On the afternoon of April 25th, 2005, a 22-year-old man who had been due that day in Canadian court to answer to assault charges against his neighbor's grandson, he had argued with him over a noise complaint and pulled a knife on him, and this was to be his sentencing hearing, arrived at the border crossing in a vehicle. Border officials were immediately alarmed by the man, probably because he was carrying on his person, and without trying to conceal any of it, a homemade sword, a hatchet, a knife, a can of pepper spray, a set of brass knuckles, and most alarming, a chainsaw with reddish stains along the chain belt. He claimed he worked for President George Bush as a government assassin, which he gave as the reason for his weapons. Obviously, none of the items were able to be taken over the border, so the U.S. Customs agents confiscated his items and fingerprinted him. A background check showed, besides that he didn't actually work for George Bush, that he was a U.S. citizen and had no warrants, and other than trying to take an arsenal of weapons with him from Canada to the U.S., hadn't violated any regulations. According to Bill Anthony, a spokesman for the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, quote, "Being bizarre is not a reason to keep somebody out of this country or lock them up," end quote. Also, according to Bill, there is no crime lab in Calais, so they were not able to look at the chainsaw and determine if the stains were blood, rust, or paint. Apparently, they did contact the Canadian RCMP and were notified that he had a court case that morning, but under U.S. law, they couldn't detain him and had to let him in. So he was allowed through minus his arsenal. Bill admitted that it sounds stupid, but that's what happened. After crossing the border, the man left his vehicle and was able to hitchhike his way to Massachusetts. Meanwhile, back in Canada, the court case about his neighbor's grandson had carried on without him. A probation officer told the court that he was concerned about the man's mental wellness, which he referred to as questionable. It was recommended by his probation officer that perhaps the man should be restricted from having any weapons. The following day, a state trooper spotted him walking along the side of a highway in the southern part of Massachusetts. He ran a check on him and found that he had missed his court hearing yesterday, and a warrant had been placed on him, so he was brought into Boston to be held and extradited back to Canada on those charges. Over on the Canadian side of the border is an even smaller town of only about 2,000 people called Minto, which is about a 2-hour drive east of Calais. And on the next day, after the strange man had entered the border, Debbie Mowat was trying to get a hold of her mom, Veronica Decarie, who everyone called Verna. Debbie's mom, Verna, lived with her common-law partner, Fred Fulton. She hadn't been able to get a hold of her parents since the 23rd and was getting worried. Fred was 74 and Verna was 70, so it wasn't completely improbable that they'd had some kind of health issue. Fred was a lovely senior who was outgoing and friendly and liked to play guitar, sometimes for the locals in town, and Verna, although more reserved than Fred, was also someone you couldn't help but like. Just all around good folks, as we say here in Canada. Not an enemy in the world. Well, except for their young neighbor who was always yelling and carrying on about something. Fred and Verna knew he was strange and he had some issues, and there had been altercations. In fact, just recently, their neighbor pulled a knife on and threatened their grandson. And you might be able to see where this is going and make a connection here. But everyone else in the town loved Verna and Fred. Verna had originally been born in Halifax, but once she found Minto, she settled in and never left her cozy little home on 358 Slope Road. Debbie decided to swing by the house that afternoon and check on her parents. Immediately, she knew something was very wrong. Debbie very nervously entered the house and was horrified to see blood pretty much everywhere. She ran through the house and discovered her mom viciously hacked and stabbed in her bedroom on the second floor. Somehow she managed to keep her wits about her and searched the house some more for her father. She found him in an even worse state, lying near the back door in the kitchen that leads to the back deck. Fred had also been hacked and stabbed to death, but he was also missing his head. Clearly, she called the police right away. RCMP Constable Don Holzman arrived on the scene around 4:30 that afternoon, and 2 years later in court, when describing what he saw, he had to take a few moments to collect himself and get his emotions in check. Entering through the back door, he noticed bloody footprints tracking away from the house on the deck. The screen door was cut and had bloody smear marks, and the wooden second door had been kicked in. There was blood in the main level bathroom, the living room, he noticed a once white but now mostly red with blood telephone originally attached to the wall had been torn from its screws. A long dagger with bloodstains was found on the living room floor. Some of the footprints tracking through the house were from bare feet, and many were from someone appearing to be wearing combat boots. And then, under the kitchen table, Dawn noticed a pillowcase that was out of place. Had this been a robbery gone wrong and the suspect fled, leaving his stolen goods behind? No. Dawn, I'm sure, wishes that's what it was. Instead, inside the pillowcase was Fred Fulton's missing head. Upstairs in the bedroom, Verna, still clad in her nightgown, was lying on the floor. Bloodstains soaking the carpet around her and the blankets and sheets on the bed. The light on the ceiling had been smashed and bits of glass were scattered on the floor. There was so much blood in the crime scene that investigators decided to turn down the heat in the house to try to preserve what they could. A grisly crime scene, to say the least. Fred and Verna's strange young neighbor was high on the suspect list. He was located in Boston, where he was being held, and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The man was 22-year-old Gregory Despres. But, of course, there is the issue of extradition. A federal judge in Boston had to decide if he was fit to be sent back to Canada to stand trial for the murders. Gregory Despres was born in Minto, New Brunswick, to his mom Jenny and dad Glendon in July of 1982. His parents separated and his mom Jenny moved to Massachusetts with him. There he seemed to thrive pretty good. He made friends easily and worked a couple of part-time jobs, played some sports, joined cadets, all that good stuff. But as he became a teenager, around the age of 16, his mom started to notice some changes in him, just some changes in his behavior and personality. She chalked it up to regular teenage moodiness and rebellion. When he was 17, he packed up and moved back to Minto to live with his father, who he had been estranged from since his parents' divorce. Angry at his mother for whatever reason, he cut ties with her. And I don't really know how things went while living with his dad. Probably not well. It sounds like his mental state continued to decline. When he was 19, his mom moved back to Minto and they reconnected. By then, he was living on his own in a trailer a very short distance from Fred and Verna. His mom was concerned that he had basically become completely isolated from society, almost never leaving his trailer except to berate his neighbors. Jenny asked him if he was on drugs, but he denied it. He continued to slip into his mental illness completely unchecked. And I get that for Jenny that would have been awful to watch because in Canada, once you turn 18, your mental health is your own business, and unless you are deemed to be a danger to yourself and to others, you can't be held and sectioned under the Mental Health Act. And especially people who suffer from delusions, they are very wary of any so-called help. So they resist treatment, they might self-medicate with illegal drugs. It's a complete horror show to watch unfold in your own child. Anyways, I don't know. None of the source documents really say what in particular her delusions were about Fred and Verna or what he found so upsetting about them, but clearly he was focused on them. I did read one report that said it was over a water line, but I don't know. That might just have been the initial thing that started it, but clearly went much further and deeper because Fred had confided to his grandson, Fred Mowat, the one that Gregory had pulled the knife on, that he was afraid of Gregory and sometimes needed medication to help him sleep over the anxiety that it was causing him. Gregory was held in the U.S. for about a year and a half, and then his Canadian trial was supposed to start in September of 2006, so he was extradited to Fredericton, New Brunswick. But Gregory fired his lawyer, Randy Mallett, over a disagreement about how his defense should be handled, so things were delayed until January of 2007. He chose to be tried by a judge rather than a jury, or at least his new lawyer, Ed Dara, decided that it was the best call, knowing the photos of Fred's headless body were going to cause a very visceral reaction from any red-blooded jury. But about a month into the trial, Gregory decided that his new lawyer, Ed, was working for Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein and wanted to fire him. Justice Clendinging said no way, but she decided that what he did need was a psych evaluation. Really? Like she just decided that now? So in April of that year, a bunch of hearings were held about his mental state, and Dr. Scott Thorold said that he wasn't fit for trial because his mental condition, which he diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenia, but another doctor said that even if he was, medication could and should help him and he'd be fine. Justice Clendening decided in the end he was not fit and put an end to the trial. So when that happens to you, it doesn't mean that you never go to trial and face any justice. It just means that they will continue to review your condition every few months until you are fit to stand trial. And but by July 2007, he had responded to medication and was good to go, so a new trial was started in November of 2007. And this trial was presided over by Justice William Grant. And all of the evidence that they presented at the first trial was readmitted. So lovely for the family to have to sit through those photos twice. During the trial, the family had to learn that Verna had been stabbed 31 times, mostly in the face and neck, and Fred, who had attempted to barricade himself into the bathroom, managed to escape only to get to the back porch and to be grabbed and dragged back inside to the kitchen, where he was stabbed 30 times in what was described as clusters and then decapitated. While watching videotaped evidence of the crime scene, Gregory appeared to doze off. The defense argued that he was clearly suffering from a mental disorder at the time of the killings and believed that he was working for the military and carrying out orders. But the Crown said that he knew exactly what he was doing when he broke into the house with a weapon and fled not just the scene, but the country. Anyways, in March 2008, he was found guilty of causing the deaths of Fred and Verna, but not criminally responsible for it. Justice Grant said, quote, "The sheer brutality of the murders makes me question whether this could be carried out by a person who understood the wrongfulness of their actions." This decision didn't really please the family too much. Fred's nephew, Michael Richardson, told reporters, "I think that's too gray of an area in the law. I just think that you're responsible for your actions regardless of what you do. If you're not responsible for your actions, who is? Someone should pay for these two people being murdered, and I don't think we got justice today." So he was sent to the She-Body Healing Center, which is part of the Dorchester Penitentiary. When found NCR, not criminally responsible, you live in a mental health hospital, which is much like a prison, but there is not a set term. So you could be out in 2 years if you respond to treatment or never get out. It's a kind of case by case. You will come up for a mental health review, I believe, every 2 years once you're sent there. In 2011, he applied to be released but was denied, and then he can reapply every 2 years. But as far as I could find out, he's still there. Now, that is kind of the end of the story, but I wanted to discuss the issue of NCR defenses in Canada and what that means as far as public safety and whatnot. I don't normally like these kinds of cases because I think they're kind of complicated in how I feel about them. When it's clear that someone is suffering from a mental illness like paranoid schizophrenia, like I'm not talking about drug-induced psychosis, where at least I personally feel that you're still culpable for your actions. And I'm definitely not talking about any personality disorders. But cases where the person, through no fault of their own, is suffering from delusions that makes them feel justified in violence and can't grasp the severity or moral wrongfulness of their actions, like I know that they are suffering. I know their families are suffering, and as horrible as their actions are, it's a tragedy that there is just simply no justice for. But how do we keep people safe on the streets when someone is capable of this kind of thing? And I also understand with the right treatment and medications that they can live normal and very productive lives. But I also know that mentally ill patients are not usually compliant with their medications and can have breakthrough episodes when under stress. So I did a little reading and research to see if I could ease our minds about it. First of all, it's important to note that people who are not responding to treatment or don't take their meds are not released back into society. So there is that. An NCR finding is actually really hard to get and isn't applied very often, at least not here in Canada, particularly for murder. In fact, in 315,701 murders, only 266 were found NCR, so not even 1%. Now, according to Justice Canada, when an accused is found not criminally responsible on account of mental disorder by a court, they are not convicted in the usual sense. Now, it also doesn't constitute an acquittal. It represents a unique third option. An accused that is found not criminally responsible by mental disorder is diverted to a provincial or territorial review board established. Review boards are specialized tribunals chaired by a judge and comprised of at least 4 other members, one of which must be entitled under the laws of the particular province to practice psychiatry. The review board can order either an absolute discharge, where you're free and no conditions, a conditional discharge where you're basically supervised, where you have to abide by these conditions. You have to reside in a particular place, like in a group home. You have to abstain from illegal drugs and or alcohol, submit to urinalysis testing for prohibited substances, abide by a specified treatment plan, report to a designated person, which is usually a psychiatrist, on a scheduled basis, and refrain from possessing weapons. Or they can keep you detained in a hospital. If detained, you may still get outside privileges, but they are at the hospital's discretion and normally supervised. A bit frightening, though, is that a study done in BC found that on average for murder, a patient was detained for an average of 1,165 days or 3 years. And of course, if you are responsible, that's a life sentence. So it's kind of scary, actually. According to Robichaud's law office, who admittedly are defense lawyers, feigning a mental illness or to obtain an NCR verdict would be a monumental challenge. The accused would have to befool both psychiatrists trained to detect malingering and a judge or jury. Even if the person convinces a psychiatrist that they have a severe mental disorder, that in itself would not be enough for an NCR verdict. The accused must prove that the mental disorder satisfied one of two bases for NCR, which are because of the mental disorder the individual is incapable of appreciating what they're doing, or because of the mental disorder, the individual is incapable of understanding what they are doing is wrong. A popular misconception is that an NCR verdict is getting away with murder, essentially. And this apparently is wrong for two reasons. First, an NCR accused may spend years in a secure psychiatric detention facility that looks a lot like a jail. Their freedoms, including outdoor access, can be very limited. Second, an individual may be under a review board's jurisdiction indefinitely, regardless of the seriousness of the crime they commit. Unlike a jail sentence, detention in a psychiatric facility does not come with a maximum term. So a crime that would otherwise carry a brief jail sentence could lead to years or a life in psychiatric detention. It is far more common for an NCR accused who committed a relatively minor offense to spend decades in detention than for an NCR accused who committed a serious violent crime to be released within a few years. According to a study published in the 2015 edition of the Canadian Journal of Psychiatry, NCR accused have a lower reoffense rate than offenders in correctional custody. Less than 1% of NCR accused commit a severe violent crime, which is like homicide, attempted murder, or sexual assault, when released into the community, which kind of disagrees with what the Government of Canada reported on about the BC study. I found a video where Charles LeBlanc talked to Mike Richardson, who is Fred's nephew, and I think it was 2016, on the morning of one of his review hearings. And Mike told Charles something that I really have to agree with. He said that the current system really struggles with trying to rehabilitate people and also doing what's right for the families of the victims. He says it's easy to say, let's try and rehabilitate people when it doesn't happen to you. When asked if he thought Gregory could be rehabilitated, he said that the way that he did the murders of Verna and Fred makes you wonder why someone that could do something like that should ever breathe air. If it doesn't happen to you, you don't see it the same way, maybe.